Welcome to The Nature Pledge, Biodiversity and Sustainability in Asia and the Pacific. My name is Sean Lees, and I work for the United Nations Development Program. It may surprise you to learn that 54% of our global terrestrial surface is comprised of rangelands, which include savannas, prairies, pampas, mountain pastures, and many other iconic habitats. They are often associated with grazing livestock and large-scale wildlife migrations. But rangelands are also integral to the cultural heritage of many countries and sustain around 500 million pastoralists worldwide. It may also surprise you to learn that pastoralism is recognized as one of the most sustainable food systems on Earth and a crucial factor in preventing biodiversity loss. Despite their importance, rangelands and pastoralists that earn their livelihoods from them are also under significant threat by a massive wave of land conversion driven by cropland expansion and other land use changes, including ill-conceived afforestation efforts. According to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, or UNCCD, up to 50% of the world's rangelands are degraded and under threat. And while these ecosystems receive far less attention and financing than forests or croplands, this may change in 2026, a year designated by the United Nations as the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. Furthermore, the business case for protecting rangeland restoration and conservation is becoming more compelling. However, mobilizing investments for rangelands will require that we address complex structural challenges. To help us unpack the ecological and economic dimensions of these vital landscapes, we are joined today by Natasha Maru, Global Lead for Rangelands and Pastoralists at the International Land Coalition. Natasha, welcome to the Nature Pledge podcast.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you for having me.
Natasha, I'm American, and as a child, I grew up with images of America's vast prairies and even with songs about America's rangelands. Are these iconic representations of open rangelands in North America and elsewhere largely a thing of the past? What shape are rangelands in today?
Rangelands continue to be thriving ecosystems, thriving environments that are rich in biodiversity. And pastoralists, who are the custodians of these rangelands, are both resilient and ingenuous. But at the same time, I think rangelands and pastoralists are both facing increasing pressures and changes, growing challenges. And so, yes, there is a certain romantic ideal of the rangelands that persists but continues to be challenged.
You know, Natasha, I was reading a report by the Economics of Land Degradation Initiative, and they say that, quote, the risk of rangeland degradation contributing to poverty, food security, drought risk, instability, and conflict is being taken seriously by many governments. Is that fair? Is that true? Is there sufficient attention by governments in rangeland degradation?
There is attention in some cases and not in others. And in fact, this is not commensurate to the extent of or importance of rangelands in particular country contexts. But I think the larger question to ask is what form this attention takes. So, for example, where there is no attention to rangelands and rangeland degradation, we see that there is a rampant conversion of rangelands to other uses, maybe for infrastructure, industry, or others. And in cases where there is attention paid, oftentimes this may take the form of restricting pastoral practices such as the collective use of rangelands or mobility. It may take the form of, afforestation or fodder plantation. All of these may restrict the sort of practices that have sustained rangelands over time and may even be damaging in some cases. For example, affecting plant species heterogeneity in rangelands by having single or alien or invasive species planted, or, for example, by releasing the soil organic carbon that is so successfully stored in rangelands over generations of work by pastoralists.
I'm wondering if it's true that across the countries that you work in, whether pastoralists enjoy less political power than farmers or people that are, in fact, behind some of the cropland expansions that you speak to.
In many cases, yes. And this is also a structural issue, you see. Farming is very much oriented towards the state understanding of productivity, right? Where you're able to have lands that are demarcated and assigned to individuals and therefore can be easily tracked or taxed. Whereas pastoralists have a practice of grazing their animals across vast landscapes, using lands collectively or shared with other land users, and also through the practice of mobility, moving from place to place, flourishing through unpredictability. And these kinds of frameworks in which pastoralists operate have always defied state logics. And therefore, oftentimes, they are left out of administrative considerations. For example, simple examples like in the context where I've worked or researched in India, where you have state borders or provincial borders, pastoralists are often crossing these provincial borders, village borders. And therefore, for example, where political will, where representation comes from, where budgets are allocated, are oftentimes not overlapping or complementing pastoralist land use practices very well.
Mm. I was reading about the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists, and some of the material out there says that the campaign aims to dispel the myth that pastoralism is like an archaic system and that all livestock are inherently destructive. But in truth, Natasha, we also hear a lot of reports about overgrazing by pastoralists. And that it might be occurring at really significant levels. How do I square these seeming contradictions that pastoralism may be driving biodiversity loss and or land degradation in one hand, and the other that no, they're actually the solution to some of our biodiversity loss challenges?
That's a great question, Sean. And I think for this particular question, it's important to understand what we actually mean by concepts like overgrazing. So, if I had to simply say what we mean by overgrazing, it's more livestock on smaller parcels of land grazing for longer periods of time, possibly. And so I think what's important is to understand the context in which this occurs. So, for example, pastoralists across the world are facing great loss of land, and land is being converted to other uses, and therefore livestock is being concentrated in particular areas. Other factors include the presence of amenities or market conditions that are again concentrated in particular places, and therefore pastoralists may concentrate their livestock in particular places because these opportunities are not dispersed. At the same time, you do have a growing population and a growing pastoral population, and therefore growing numbers of livestock. But at the same time, we see that there's a failure of generational renewal, or there isn't enough support for young people within pastoralism. And therefore, for example, last year when I was in Mongolia, we visited a pastoralist family who had a large flock of sheep, a large herd of livestock, but they weren't able to milk enough because they didn't have enough farm hands to do the milking. At the same time, the milk value chain was not so well developed, and therefore they relied on the meat value chain or on the wool value chain, for which you need larger numbers of animals. In a context like Mongolia, also they are facing increasing droughts as well as extreme weather conditions such as harsh winters, where you have large loss of livestock, and therefore pastoralists tend to keep larger flocks to make sure that they're able to pass over these difficult times. And then there are cultural practices. For example, they don't prefer to slaughter young animals. They'd like to have their animals grow a bit and have happy childhoods. And therefore, you'd have, again, larger flocks because you wouldn't destock at a rate fast enough. Um, so there are many factors I think that we need to account for. Climate change is another one, which is actually changing land use patterns and is shifting, pastoralist grazing availability and so on, therefore concentrating livestock in certain areas where there's land loss also to complement these shifting weather patterns. So to understand pastoralism is also to understand livestock. And when we talk only about overgrazing, we're putting all of the responsibility on an individual herder without accounting for the pressures that that herder is facing. But when pastoralism is allowed to operate through its own rationality, use lands collectively and through shared practices, be mobile, breed livestock with resilient local species, and so on, then pastoralism can be a sustainable practice and, in fact, adaptive, restorative, and contributing to environmental values.
I've heard that one of the solutions is to strengthen communal land tenure and customary governance systems that pastoralists rely on for the herd mobility. That must be a problem that's been with us for some time now, though. What are these solutions at hand? How do you strengthen communal land tenure for people that have operated according to traditional seasonal movements for generations and generations and generations?
Sean, given this year, we have a great opportunity, in fact, to bring to light the importance of strengthening customary and communal land tenure for pastoralists. This year is the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists, as you said, and it also converges with the UNCCD COP17 in Mongolia, which has long been a champion of pastoralists. And therefore, we know that there will be a lot of conversations at this COP about pastoralism and rangelands. So, in addition to or sort of framing together the alliance building work and the advocacy work that we've been doing at ILC, we have a global campaign directed towards these policy opportunities called the Mobility Matters campaign. And the Mobility Matters campaign very much tries to nuance the conversation on pastoralist land tenure to include considerations of pastoral mobility, to nuance conversations and have mobility language included within conversations about climate action, restoration, biodiversity, conservation. And we do this by linking national level campaigns with regional and global policy initiatives and opportunities, together with strong storytelling and narrative building around mobility as a pastoralist strategy and as a practice that heals the planet.
I know this is a campaign that's in effect now, but speaking to someone like yourself, Natasha, has been working in this space for a very long time. How effective are these campaigns? What's kind of progress have you experienced maybe over the last 5 years working for either International Land Coalition or others on rangelands?
Sean, rangelands cover over half of the Earth's terrestrial surface, and they're home to 500 million pastoralists, also benefiting close to 2 billion people across the planet. And still, we find that within government policy, within these national action plans and the MBSAPs and all of these kinds of instruments and plans that the governments are making, that rangelands have not been very strongly featured or prominently acted on. And yet we find that in the last 5 years, we see this kind of upsurge of interest in rangelands within policy spaces from the national to the global level. This, in large part, is thanks to the campaign that has been running for the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists that was initiated now 10 years ago by the Global Alliance, which was successful then in having the International Year declared in 2022. And since then, I think organizations like the International Land Coalition and some of its members and partner organizations have been making strong efforts into ensuring that rangelands are included not only as a separate focus and a special focus area, which it will be as it should be, but as well as mainstream across considerations for land based communities and action on land. So I think we're seeing this growing attention and it's very welcome.
You mentioned earlier that climate change and drought or extreme weather was also impacting on herd health and or the health of pastoralists. And I'm wondering if these efforts at combating climate change through either afforestation or even in solar farms, etc., are climate change mitigation projects like afforestation or solar farms, etc. Are they a really big issue for pastoralists?
Thanks, Sean, for this question. I think also, again, this depends on the context and the ways in which this is done. In many cases, we've had experience historically of afforestation being not beneficial to rangelands or pastoralists. And this is because oftentimes plants that are not indigenous to the rangelands, are invasive species, have been planted. Plantations have taken place along mobility routes, restricting movements, restricting local land use practices, as well as an afforested area may actually wither the sort of natural benefits that rangelands environments can offer. For example, the sort of soil fertility that comes from the manure of the livestock, as well as through years of grazing, is also enabling carbon sequestration at a large scale in as soil organic carbon. But the minute you afforest that grassland, you're releasing that into more unstable forms of carbon sequestration. So again, climate mitigation efforts through afforestation and restoration practices through afforestation can have certain benefits if done together with local communities and by sort of leveraging local knowledges, traditional practices. But when they're done completely in isolation of, any dialogue with local communities, with pastoralists, with indigenous peoples who have been living on and off the land, then they can have deteriorative effects.
What about nature conservation efforts, though? In some parts of Asia, particularly in China, there's been a really big push to create protected areas across wide swaths of territory. Have pastoralists run into trouble with state efforts to conserve nature, whether that be under the Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework 30 by 30 or any other national initiative?
Yes, pastoralists have often run into trouble with conservation efforts. This is not only in Asia, but also in other areas, also in Africa. We have this common concern among pastoralists. What we've understood, and I think what international development organizations and governments are beginning to understand, is that conservation efforts cannot be in the form of fortress conservation or completely closing off lands to people that have been using it. Pastoralists and rangelands have actually co-evolved historically. It is through the custodianship, through the careful and intelligent management of rangelands by pastoralists, through their practices such as collective uses of land and mobility, that pastoralists have managed to sustain rangelands through generations. And in fact, leaning on this wisdom is actually, a great way forward. We can really make something together if we work together with local communities.
What about working with the private sector? Has there been interest from the private sector in shoring up the protection of rangelands, and what might be some of the challenges to attracting private finance?
I think there might be others who might be better placed to answer this question, but I can try to say a bit from my perspective. You've mentioned, Sean, the Economics of Land Degradation report, making the business case for rangeland restoration. That report very clearly states that for every dollar invested in rangelands, the value that's received is at the level of $35. And this is great returns for any private sector investment. We also know that the cost of inaction, that is to let rangelands degrade, is very high as compared to the cost of restoring rangelands, which can offer these benefits. And so I think there's a great case to make for private sector investment and also public and private sector partnerships for rangelands.
Well, on that note, Natasha, allow me to say thank you for the work you're doing, and wish you luck in getting your message out there, even to a wider audience in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia at COP17 this year. Thank you too for being on the Nature Pledge podcast.
Thanks, Sean. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Nature Pledge, Biodiversity and Sustainability in Asia and the Pacific. Please visit our website at undp.org/nature for more information on our work, and subscribe to our show for notifications on upcoming episodes. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please let us know and share this episode with your friends. Until next time, take care.